So well done for making it through the first part of the JavaScript module. It's great that you've been able to learn things about variables, functions, operators, comparison operators, and other things. What I want to make sure is that we don't get too bogged down with all the conceptual stuff, and I want to make sure every now and then we take a step back and look at how we can make this fun and interactive for users. So in this lecture, I basically just want to go over how we can now look at having variables and the operators we were using to have something where the user can actually make a change and they can actually interact with the page and change one of our variables. So what I'm going to do here is basically just put in a paragraph and say, let's say something like the value is currently, and then I'm going to have another paragraph here that's just going to be blank. And then I'm going to put a button underneath. I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing in a second. Click 2 plus 1. So essentially what I want to do, actually I'm just going to put this at 0 to start with. That's better. So on this page we currently have a paragraph saying the value is currently, and then another paragraph saying 0. And then what I want to do is have it so that when the user clicks on this button, this number is going to go up each time I click it by plus 1. So how do you think that we could do this? So essentially what you might remember is in the previous lecture with operators, we could do something where we change a variable. What I think we should do to start off with is just create our variable. So I'm going to create a variable called value, var value. So make sure that we have it linked together. Otherwise we are going nowhere fast. So src equals user interaction variables. Okay, cool. So I'm going to create a value, and this value is going to be set to 0 to begin with. So what I want to happen is that essentially every time a user clicks this button, I want this value to go up by 1. So how could we do that? Well, first of all, we want to make sure that we are having it so that when we click this button, it interacts with our JavaScript. So let's just start there. So essentially we're going to go to the button and say onClick, sorry, no need for uppercase there, onClick equals add 1. Okay. So now in here we need to create the function. So we're going to say function. So we're going to create a function called add1, empty brackets, and then in here we're then going to put in what we want to happen. And essentially what we want to do is two things. The first thing we want to do is make sure that this number 0 goes up by 1. So essentially we have a value 0 here. So why don't we just put in here value equals value plus 1. So we're essentially saying when this function is called, just add 1 to the value. And for brownie points, you may remember that there's a shorthand for this in JavaScript, which is just plus equals. So when I do value plus equals 1, I'm basically saying add 1 to the value. And for now, just to make sure it's working, I'm just going to say alert and then value, just so we can check that it's all working. So if I click here, what I'm hoping will happen is the pop-up appears saying the number 1. Fantastic. And then if I click again, 2, 3. Fantastic. So we've definitely got the starting of something good here. Now, the reason why I haven't added this into my function, can you think of why? Maybe pause the video here and have a think as to why I haven't included this in my function. So let's go over to this together and think about it together, because this is often a sticking point where students get confused as to why we're not including it in here. Well, if you think about what we'd be doing, the user would click and it'd call the function. The value would be set to 0. Then we would add 1. So, okay, let's see what happens. Fantastic, it goes to 1. What if we click it again though? It seems to stay at 1 each time. So basically, each time the function is being called, the value is being reset to 0. Whereas if we include it outside of the function, then it's just being set to 0 at the start of the browser loading, and then each time we're running the function, we're just adding 1. We're not resetting the value to 0. This just stays at the start, and it doesn't get reset every time the button is clicked and the function is called. So now that we have that working, now what should we do? Well, instead of having this alert, why don't we change this paragraph to whatever the value is? So in order to do that, what we need to do is the document.getID stuff. So I'm going to give the paragraph an ID of, let's say, number, I don't know. Okay. And then in here, we're going to, instead of using alert, we're going to do document.getElementById, and then I'm going to call this number. And then in order to change the HTML, we just use inner HTML. And then we change it to the value. So that now, when we refresh the page, so it's not working just yet. So what I suggest we do is we look at the developer console. So I'm going to do on PC, Control-Shift-I. And once that's loaded, here we are. Oh, I think I've loaded that in Atom rather than in the browser. There we go, that's better. So if I refresh and then I try and click it, let's see what the error says. Okay, so it's saying unquote type error. So this line is not a function. Aha, so I realize what I've done is this is thinking that I'm trying to call a function. So I've actually used the wrong syntax. So what I want to do is just put equals value instead of putting that in brackets. I believe. There we go. So let's have a go now, see what happens. Okay, fantastic. So that's just showing you how the developer's console can be very, very helpful to solve these situations. So when I click this now, it's just going to keep going up for as long as I like. So fantastic, that's working nicely. So just to summarize what we've done in this lecture, we've gone over how we can now have the user interact with our screen, with our HTML, and directly change variables in our JavaScript. The way that we've done that is that we initially set a variable that was in our JavaScript. And then we had a function. When it's called, it changes the value of this JavaScript. The way that we had it that the user can then interact is that when they click on this button, each time they call the function. And this function, each time it's clicked, will change the value by 1. It's adding 1 to its own value. We could obviously change that number. And then it just goes up to whatever we want. It's quite fun just messing around like this sometimes. There we go. And then finally, in order for that to feed back into our HTML, we gave our paragraph an ID, and then we used the document.getElementById, using that ID, .animateHTML, and then plugging in the new value in here. So hopefully that's been of help to you. So in the next practical, we're going to be using exactly what we've learned here. So if you're feeling confident, feel free to go ahead onto the next lecture where we'll be doing the practical. Otherwise, maybe have a go at this yourself, just using this basic button, interacting with JavaScript. Go back over this lecture maybe, and then when you're feeling confident, I'll see you in the next lecture.